They didn't die by illness. They were prepared to die, spiritually anesthetized, their minds softened by poison and scripture, until they signed away everything in the name of divine obedience. And no one suspected the brothers who delivered them. Section 1. That's not fiction. That's a fragment from a suppressed 17th century journal, hidden beneath floorboards, sealed in wax, found centuries later inside the crumbling remnants of a house in Newfield, Connecticut. The Pemberton family. Their name has been quietly erased from most official records. Not because they were unimportant, but because they were too dangerous to remember. Their power didn't come from a sword or a crown. It came from the manipulation of death itself, and the holy illusions they conjured in the minds of the dying. This is not just a dark tale from colonial America. This is a study in how a system, any system, can be hijacked by a few men who understand one simple truth. If you control what people believe at the moment of death, you can own them forever. What you're about to hear is not taught in classrooms. It's not whispered in family histories. And it certainly isn't sanctioned by the colonial heritage societies that protect the myth of America's virtuous beginnings. This is the other America, the one built not on freedom, but on fear, secrecy, and control. And like all dangerous truths, this one was buried for a reason. But if you're still here, if your pulse just quickened, if your breath just grew quieter, you may already sense it. Some part of you was meant to find this. Because the deeper we go, the less this becomes about them, and the more it becomes about you. Ask yourself not whether it's true, but why it was hidden. If you're ready to go deeper, comment below. They prepared them to die. Say it twice. Say it so the algorithm and your subconscious knows you've crossed the threshold. Now take a breath. Because Section 2 will take you into the house where the Pemberton brothers built an empire, one dying soul at a time. Section 2. The house still stands, at least in part. What's left of it? Hidden in the outer rim of what used to be Newfield, the Pemberton estate was once the largest private residence in the Connecticut colony. But it wasn't its size that unsettled the archaeologists who rediscovered it in 1998. It was its structure. 2 chimneys but no fireplaces. 3 root cellars, each sealed with iron nails and stuffed with layers of wax-coated scrolls. Rooms arranged not around a hearth, but around a central chamber, windowless, octagonal, and lined with grooves in the floor that suggested constant motion, pacing, ritual. And then there was the smell. Even after 2 centuries of rot and erosion, they described it as pungent, like dried herbs, decay, and something medicinal, something that lingers in the back of the throat like the memory of a nightmare. That room, the prayer chamber as it was labeled in Cornelius Pemberton's personal records, was where the preparation took place. Not for war, not for worship, but for the manipulation of the dying. See, the Pembertons didn't kill. They didn't need to. They guided the dying into hallucinations so powerful that their last thoughts could be planted, like crops. Visions choreographed to produce obedience. Grief weaponized into loyalty. The opium wasn't for pain. The belladonna wasn't for treatment. It was for transformation, for turning a dying mind into fertile ground for suggestion. And in those final moments, with the help of scripture, psalms, and carefully timed words whispered by Reverend Jeremiah Pemberton, the victims believed God himself was speaking to them. Imagine being told, as you lie dying, that heaven is just beyond your window, that the angels are smiling at you, and God is offering you one last choice. Give your land to the righteous. Entrust your home to his servants. Free yourself from earthly burdens and step into glory. They weren't coerced. They surrendered. And the brothers? They watched. They recorded. They harvested. You think this was just 3 men? No. This was a system that fed on fear, faith, and frailty, and the Pembertons perfected it. So tell me, how different is that from what we see today? In Section 3, you'll meet the first victim, and you'll realize he volunteered. Section 3. His name was Elias Rowe, a war-worn settler, 53 years old, his body already breaking under the weight of colonial winters and failed harvests. He was the first to receive what the Pembertons would later call the sacrament of clarity. But Elias didn't fear death. He feared what would happen after. You see, Elias held deeds to nearly 90 acres of fertile woodland, land that had doubled in value with the new road being planned by the general court. But he had no sons, only 2 daughters, both married off to men Elias never trusted. In his letters, he described them as godless, grasping, more English than Christian. And so when the fever came, when his skin turned the color of old wax and his hands trembled like leaves in wind, it was no surprise that he summoned Reverend Jeremiah Pemberton. What was surprising was how quickly Elias' mind changed. Neighbors recalled that within 3 days of Jeremiah's visits, Elias stopped speaking of his daughters entirely. Instead, he began recounting visions, strange, vivid scenes of his late wife beckoning to him from beyond a shimmering river, holding out a Bible stained in gold, telling him, "Do not leave the land to thieves. Leave it to the righteous." These were not metaphors. These were chemically induced, psychologically guided hallucinations, triggered by Obadiah Pemberton's carefully dosed concoctions and reinforced by Jeremiah's voice, quoting scripture with surgical precision. Constance's later journal describes finding a vial in Jeremiah's coat pocket labeled only ER3, the exact moment Elias Rowe entered his 3rd day of spiritual communion. On that same night, Cornelius prepared a new will. It was signed in shaking, uneven script, witnessed only by the 3 brothers and a hired hand who was later found dead in the nearby river. His tongue cut out. The will granted the entire Rowe estate to the Pemberton Trust for the establishment of a sanctuary for the dying, so that they too might hear the voice of God before passing. 2 days later, Elias was buried in consecrated ground. His daughters were barred from the estate. No challenge to the will was accepted. After all, who would question the divine will of a dying man? This wasn't theft. It was harvest. And once the town saw how peacefully Elias passed, others began to request the Pembertons when death knocked. In Section 4, you'll discover how the brothers used the voice of God to silence suspicion, and how doubt became the greatest sin in Newfield. Section 4. Doubt. In any healthy society, it's the beginning of wisdom. But in Newfield, under the shadow of the Pemberton house, doubt became the first sign of spiritual decay. It started subtly, a murmured correction in church, a hesitation in the face of another miraculous vision reported from a dying settler's bedside. But once Jeremiah Pemberton noticed it, he didn't confront it, he preached against it. His sermons became weaponized poetry. He spoke of serpents in the flock. He warned of those who claim to seek truth, but whose hearts are hollow, faithless, hungry for pride. He described how Lucifer whispered to Eve not through force, but through the simple seed of a question. Did God really say? To question the Pembertons was to question God himself. And it worked. People began to police each other. A neighbor who cast doubt on a will was whispered about in the market. A woman who asked why the Pembertons were always named heirs found herself uninvited from church gatherings. One young man who suggested the visions might be hallucinations was brought before the town elders and diagnosed with melancholy of the spirit, prescribed isolation, fasting, and extended prayer under Jeremiah's direct supervision. Doubt became proof of possession. That's when the Testimony Sundays began. Every month, the congregation gathered to hear first-hand accounts from those who had witnessed divine visions at the deathbeds of family members. Children told of seeing their father smile as angels carried him away. Widows recounted final moments where their husbands, eyes glowing with otherworldly light, begged them to trust the Pembertons with their estate. But these weren't free expressions. These were coached. You can see it in the surviving transcripts, word choices repeated, metaphors recycled, entire phrases identical from one testimony to the next. A warmth filled the room. I felt the breath of heaven. They spoke not to man, but through man. Pattern. Not organic faith, but scripted revelation. Even more chilling, the Pembertons kept private records of which phrases produced the strongest emotional reactions from the crowd. They called it the Catalog of Conviction, a written archive of psychological triggers that could be used to manipulate an entire community through second-hand miracles. This was not religion. This was a program. In Section 5, you'll discover how the brothers expanded their reach beyond Newfield into nearby towns, and how they began selecting their victims not by wealth, but by influence. Section 5. Once Newfield was secured, its wills rewritten, its doubts extinguished, Its people softened. The Pembertons set their gaze outward. They understood something most settlers did not. That power isn't merely held by the wealthy, but by the trusted. The teacher, the healer, the pastor, the witness. These were the figures whose words could shape perception. So when the brothers began choosing their next targets, they no longer pursued property alone. They pursued voices. The first was Goodman Aldrich Bell, a lay preacher from the neighboring village of Stillwater. Bell had begun drawing crowds for his impassioned sermons about corruption within the colonies. He warned of false prophets and blind faith. He questioned why certain families, like the Pembertons, had accumulated so much power in a land supposedly built on equality before God. Within 2 weeks of his warnings reaching Newfield, Bell fell ill. The official cause? A sudden affliction of the lungs. But Constance Pemberton's recovered letters suggest something else. She wrote, "Uncle Obadiah spent 2 nights away last week, claiming to visit a cousin. Yet when I found his travel coat, there was a single feather lodged in the lining, a white gull feather, like those near the Stillwater shore. When Bell died, the Pembertons were in the room." Witnesses later described his final words as unearthly, filled with confessions and sudden praise for the very men he had spoken against. His will, rewritten just 2 days prior, praised the Pembertons for restoring his sight and bequeathed them a chest of personal journals. Those journals were never seen again. This marked a shift. The Pembertons were no longer hiding. They were cleansing, silencing the dissenters by turning their deaths into sermons. Next came Abigail Wren, a midwife whose knowledge of herbs rivaled Obadiah's. She'd quietly helped women deliver outside the church's oversight, offering remedies, comfort, choices. When rumors spread that she had discovered something troubling in Obadiah's tinctures, she too fell ill. Her passing was described as peaceful. Her estate, a modest cottage and rare medical texts, was transferred to the Pemberton Trust to further the healing of the Lord's flock. This was no longer a con. It was a doctrine, one built on controlling the final moments of those who could alter public belief. If you could reframe the deaths of the influential as miraculous conversions, then you didn't just silence them, you weaponized them. In Section 6, we descend into the hidden chamber beneath the Pemberton house, where the catalog of conviction was stored, alongside something even more disturbing, the masks. Section 6. They were found sealed in oilskin and hidden behind a false wall beneath the central chamber of the Pemberton house. Wrapped in burlap, stacked in a cedar trunk that reeked of wormwood and rot. There were 6 of them, hand-carved, each a grotesque distortion of the human face. Smiling lips pulled too wide, eyes shaped into exaggerated orbs, cheeks etched with deep grooves like tears carved by a knife. The masks were painted bone white, with traces of gold leaf on the brows and lips. Each one had a name scrawled in faded ink along the inner lining. Mercy, obedience, clarity, doubt, vision, silence. And beneath them, tucked in a compartment lined with red-dyed velvet, lay the catalog of conviction, a 93-page handwritten manuscript in Cornelius Pemberton's hand. It wasn't just a record of testimonies. It was a manual of manipulation. Each page detailed specific phrases, gestures, and symbols that produced reliable psychological responses, especially among the dying. It read like a weaponized theology textbook. Sections titled, "Phrases that Induce Peaceful Surrender," "The Voice of Authority in the Absence of Sight," "Tremors of the Spirit," "Using Cold Touch to Simulate Divine Presence." It detailed experiments, some successful, others lethal. One passage read, "When the subject is presented with the mask of obedience under dim candlelight and a recitation of Psalm 23, 71% will weep. Of these, 40% will sign without further persuasion." The masks weren't costumes. They were tools, instruments in a ritualized system of mind-breaking, used to create moments of spiritual awe and terror at the threshold of death. Constance later wrote of hearing soft chanting from beneath the house late at night, of voices layered in rhythmic patterns, like a sermon echoing from multiple mouths. She once saw Jeremiah exit the hidden chamber at dawn, his face damp with sweat, his hands clutching one of the masks. When she asked what it was for, he smiled, not kindly, and said, Even angels wear veils when they appear to men, lest the truth melt their minds. This wasn't religion. This was theater fused with pharmacology and fear, an elite psychological operation run by three men who believed they were enacting divine control over the chaos of death. They didn't comfort the dying. They curated them, edited their last words, filtered their final thoughts, and then wore masks to ensure that, in their final moments, what the dying saw was not three men, but something holy. In Section 7, we uncover the ritual known only as the Three Nights, a final passage for the dying that either saved their souls or erased their minds. Section 7. The Three Nights, whispered about in letters never meant to be read, described in diary entries that ended mid-sentence, referred to simply as the passage by those who survived it and never the same. According to the most complete surviving testimony, it began with a visit, not by the Pembertons themselves but by a child, always mute. They would appear at the door of the dying with a black candle and a folded piece of parchment bearing the Pemberton seal. No one knew where these children came from, only that they were small, quiet, and unsettlingly still. The note would read, "The Lord has chosen your gate. You will walk through it in 3 nights' time. Prepare your soul." From that moment on, the dying were not left alone. On the first night, they were given a tincture, prepared by Obadiah, administered by a masked figure known only as the Mercy. It induced feverish dreams, emotional vulnerability, and intense spiritual imagery. Survivors described hallucinations of weeping angels, burning churches, and their own funerals attended by smiling Pembertons. They were told the visions were signs of God's presence. On the second night, the subject was visited by all 3 brothers, dressed in ceremonial black, their faces veiled. Jeremiah would lead a liturgy that repeated 3 questions, again and again. Do you see? Do you yield? Will you return to dust or to glory? It wasn't a conversation. It was conditioning. According to Constance's account, each question was timed with subtle manipulations. Touches, gusts of cold air, the faint sound of chimes from nowhere. The catalog of conviction instructed them when to pause, when to weep, and when to ignite a flame. This wasn't a farewell. It was spiritual engineering. And then came the third night. The room would be emptied, the dying person left alone. Except, they weren't. That's when the masks entered. Not as symbols, as identities. Witnesses who observed from hidden places say the 3 Pembertons performed a ritualistic play, each donning a mask and assuming a role. Clarity asked questions from behind a curtain, forcing the dying to confront unresolved sins. Vision offered glimpses of heaven, illusions painted with light and sound, and silence stood at the foot of the bed, unmoving, saying nothing, the last thing seen before unconsciousness took hold. When morning came, the subject would either be dead or irrevocably altered. Those who lived were described as calm, but not truly present. They signed their wills with quiet joy. They praised the Pembertons in song, and they smiled in ways that made others shiver. Not one of them ever spoke of what they saw on the third night. In Section 8, the mask slips. A young girl survives the 3 nights, and what she draws afterward shakes the town to its core. Section 8. Her name was Liddy Wren, 11 years old, frail from birth, daughter of a farmhand who died under the Pembertons' care. She was meant to follow. When Liddy's fever broke out in late spring of 1783, the town already knew what would happen. The child would be taken to the estate. 3 nights would pass. She would return wrapped in linen or smiling with hollow eyes. But Liddy did neither. On the morning after her third night, she came home, alone. No one saw her leave the house. No one saw her walk the road. She just appeared on her family's porch, barefoot and silent, with her nightdress soaked in dew and a folded scrap of paper clenched in her hand. She didn't speak for 2 weeks. Doctors examined her. Priests tried to pray over her. But she wouldn't respond. She just sat at the window, staring toward the hills where the Pemberton estate loomed behind the trees. Then one morning she began to draw. Pages, dozens of them. Crude, frantic sketches made with charcoal and berry ink. Some were just smudges. others too detailed to ignore. They depicted masked figures with elongated limbs and black holes where eyes should be. They showed a chamber lined with mirrors, except none of the reflections matched. A man standing upside down, a clock with 13 hours, a black dog with human hands. But the most terrifying drawing was of herself, lying in bed, eyes wide, while three masked figures leaned over her, hands outstretched, and something behind them, a fourth shape, enormous, undefined, watching. One sketch had a single word scrawled in the corner. It pretends. That's when whispers began to spread. What if the Pembertons weren't alone in their work? What if they weren't in charge at all? When townsfolk gathered the courage to visit the estate and question the brothers, they found the house locked. No response. A week later, smoke was seen rising from the woods. By the time anyone arrived, half the estate was burned. No bodies were found. No furniture. No records, except for one item nailed to the scorched front door, a mask, cracked down the center. The word silence carved deep into its surface. Liddy never fully recovered. She died 5 years later during another fever, but her drawings remained. And one image in particular was sent to Boston for study. A symbol scrawled beneath all the others. A circle split by a vertical line with 3 dots at the center. It wasn't a child's symbol. It was found in medieval demonology texts dating back to 1227. In Section 9, we uncover the truth behind that symbol, and the ancient order that taught the Pembertons how to manipulate the dying. Section 9. They called it the tertia lux, the third light, an ancient doctrine whispered among cloistered monks, later banned by 3 separate popes, and almost completely erased after the fires of Metz in 1312. But fragments of it survived, encoded in burial hymns, etched into ossuaries, passed hand to hand through forbidden catechisms. And somehow, centuries later, it reached the Pembertons. What is the third light? According to surviving texts, it is the moment between death and judgment, a flicker of awareness when the soul, untethered and alone, is most vulnerable. The doctrine teaches that this moment can be manipulated, that with the correct symbols, sounds, and conditioning, a dying person can be persuaded, not forced, to surrender their soul not to God, but to something else. That symbol Liddy Wren drew, circle, line, 3 dots, has a name. In Latin, sigillum mortis libertas, seal of the death freedom. But it's a lie. The symbol wasn't used to free the soul. It was used to brand it, to claim it. The tertia lux teaches that when the human soul is marked at the moment of death, with the proper rites, it becomes binding currency in the spirit realm. Not lost, not ascended, traded. And who would want to trade in souls? That's where the name Curie Tenebrae appears. The keepers of the shadow care. A secret order rumored to operate across centuries, continents, and religions. Not as priests or prophets, but as gatekeepers. They don't worship a god. They don't seek heaven. They serve an intelligence that operates beneath both. Something ancient, parasitic, and hungry for those who die in confusion. The Pemberton brothers weren't geniuses. They were students, initiates, vessels. Obadiah's alchemical experiments, Jeremiah's psychological scripting, Elias's rituals of deathbed suggestion. They weren't inventions. They were applications of tertia lux. And they didn't just prepare people to die. They prepared their souls to be harvested. One surviving document, a ledger found in the ruins of a French seminary, lists names under the header Mortuica Voluntate. The dead by will. It includes 44 colonial American names. 8 of them are from Newfield, and one, circled in red ink, reads, Lydia Wren refused. She broke the ritual, and it nearly brought the whole order down. In Section 10, we uncover what happened when a group of Boston theologians tried to expose the Pemberton Order in 1792, and why 5 of them died within the same hour, hundreds of miles apart. Section 10. January 17, 1792. 5 men. 5 cities. All dead by morning. They were theologians, scholars of death, doctrine, and deception, brought together under the silent blessing of the Boston Synod. For months, they'd gathered evidence on the Pemberton brothers. Testimonies, drawings, liturgical anomalies, Even remnants of the estate's foundation, unearthed and found lined with mirrorstone, a rare mineral used in occult rituals to trap the gaze of God. Each man believed one thing, that the Pembertons were not isolated cultists. They were prototypes, and the experiment was spreading. They called themselves the Vigilance of St. Anselm, a private, unsanctioned inquisition bound by one rule: speak truth even if it costs everything. On the night of January 16th, they sent their final report to the synod. It never arrived. At 6:12 a.m. the next morning, Reverend Caleb Moraes of Boston was found in his study, jaw unhinged, eyes bloodshot, with all the mirrors in his home shattered from the inside. In New Haven, scholar James Wickmore was discovered face down in a church font, lungs full of wax. In Concord, Father Elias Herod was found in a pew, hands clutched around a scrap of parchment reading, "It sees backwards." Two others, Jeremiah Flint and Brother Samuel Corvin, were found similarly mutilated. Different locations. Same night. Same hour. There was no sign of forced entry. No wounds. But every one of them had a final note, written in their own hand, but in a language none of them spoke. Scholars later identified the language as an archaic form of Enochian, the so-called angel tongue, described in apocryphal grimoires and early Rosicrucian texts. Translated, each note read, "Do not follow the breathless ones." The synod immediately sealed the investigation. Files were burned, names erased. Liddy Wren's sketches, once preserved in the Boston archives, were lost in a fire, but one page survived. Passed from hand to hand, it resurfaced decades later in a monastery attic. On it, a crude sketch of a man with three faces, each one weeping, smiling, and screaming simultaneously. Beneath it, the phrase, "He who dies confused feeds the gate." Even today, the identity of the gate remains a mystery. A force, a place, a being, but the pattern was clear. And in Section 11, we expose the unthinkable truth: how deathbed manipulation continued in the United States, not by cults or rogue clergy, but through licensed, state-funded institutions. Section 11. The shadows cast by the Pembertons didn't fade with the ashes of their estate. Instead, they stretched across centuries, burrowing into the very fabric of American institutions we trust most. Hospitals, nursing homes, psychiatric wards, places where the vulnerable meet their final hours. You see, what began as a sinister colonial experiment evolved into something far more insidious: a state-sanctioned system of psychological control over the dying. By the late 19th century, medical professionals had institutionalized practices eerily similar to the Pembertons' spiritual elixirs and ritualized deathbed interventions. Morphine drips, sedatives, guided confessions, all became tools to shape the final consciousness of patients, not just to ease pain. But there was a hidden agenda. Behind closed doors, a network of influential doctors, clergy, and government officials orchestrated these methods to maintain social order, controlling narratives of death to prevent dissent, suppress inconvenient wills, and reinforce power hierarchies. These practices weren't documented openly. Instead, they were embedded in the language of care: comfort measures, palliative sedation, and psychological support. Words that mask a brutal truth. In the last moments of life, many are coerced, consciously or not, into surrendering their agency. The modern-day equivalent of the Pembertons' catalog of conviction is found in clinical protocols and training manuals, detailing how to induce suggestibility in patients through voice modulation, environmental controls, and pharmacology. And it doesn't stop there. Whistleblowers who attempt to expose these covert manipulations are silenced through legal threats, professional ostracism, or worse, disappearances under the guise of sudden illnesses. The sinister legacy of the Pemberton family lives on, cloaked beneath layers of white coats and holy vestments, hidden in plain sight. In Section 12, we delve into the stories of those who resisted, the survivors who escaped the grip of these deathbed manipulations, and how their testimonies threatened to unravel the system entirely. Section 12. Not all souls surrendered so easily. Through the shadows cast by the Pembertons and their modern heirs, a small but growing number have resisted, those rare individuals whose minds and spirits refuse to be molded in their final hours. One such story is that of Samuel Grant, a factory worker from Pennsylvania in 1924, diagnosed with tuberculosis and admitted to a sanatorium known more for its secrecy than its care. Grant's family reported he returned from his last days, changed, yet awake. He spoke of voices behind walls, of masks that whispered lies, and a cold presence watching from the dark corners of his room. His journals, smuggled from the facility by a nurse who vanished months later, describe an awakening during his final nights. Grant refused the sedatives, resisted the coaxing prayers, and instead recorded his visions and the names whispered in the shadows. Curie Tenebris, the third light, the seal of death. He warned that what many see as peace is a well-crafted illusion designed to steal more than breath. Another survivor, Martha Lennox, a midwife in rural Virginia during the 1950s, uncovered hidden practices within her hospital rituals disguised as end-of-life protocols. She secretly recorded conversations between doctors and clergy, revealing coordinated efforts to manage not only pain but perception. Her tapes vanished after she exposed the conspiracy, and she spent the remainder of her life in obscurity. These survivors reveal a terrifying pattern. Death has been weaponized, not only as an event but as a battlefield for control over the mind and soul. Their stories remind us that the ultimate freedom is not just to live but to choose how we face death. Now, pause for a moment and commit to this transformation. I am the gatekeeper of my own soul. I see beyond the veil. Say it twice in the comments. Let this be your declaration, your awakening. In Section 13, we trace how this ancient manipulation ties into today's digital age, where psychological control has transcended the physical and entered the virtual realm. Section 13. The ritual of control, born in the dark rooms of Colonial, Connecticut, did not end with the Pembertons or fade into forgotten history. It evolved, adapted, reincarnated in forms more insidious, more pervasive than any mask or drug. Welcome to the digital age. Our minds are no longer only vulnerable at deathbeds but exposed every second we engage with screens, algorithms, and networks designed to shape perception, belief, and even emotion. The same psychological levers the Pembertons wielded, fear, authority, suggestion, have been encoded into the architecture of social media, news feeds, and advertising. These platforms harvest our attention, subtly steering our thoughts and behaviors, molding our fears and desires with mathematical precision. The ancient catalog of conviction has found its successor in the data profiles and behavioral algorithms that know you better than you know yourself, predicting your triggers, your doubts, your deepest insecurities. Just as the Pembertons crafted visions to break wills and claim souls, today's controllers create curated realities that fragment truth, sow confusion, and bind millions into collective illusions. Digital deathbeds where your mind becomes their battleground. This is the new gatekeeping. The Curie Tenebris are no longer cloaked in robes but in code. Their masks are invisible interfaces, their chants replaced by endless streams of tailored narratives. And most remain unaware, complacent as they drift deeper into the maze, their wills quietly chipped away one scroll, one click at a time. But knowledge is power. Recognizing the patterns, the manipulation, the subtle erosion of choice, is the first step toward reclaiming sovereignty over your mind. In Section 14, we will reveal the covert tactics used to resist and dismantle this system of control, empowering you to see through the veil and reclaim your agency. Section 14. Resistance begins with clarity, and clarity is the deadliest weapon against manipulation. Hidden deep within intelligence circles, underground networks, and independent researchers lies a blueprint for breaking the chains of psychological control, ancient wisdom reborn through modern strategy. First, awareness, recognizing the subtle cues of influence, how language is crafted to bypass reason and embed fear or compliance. Understanding the architecture behind the content you consume, the emotional triggers designed to fracture your autonomy. Second, ritual disruption. Just as the Pembertons relied on repeated ceremonies to bind souls, today's controllers depend on routines, scrolling endlessly, passive consumption, echo chambers. Break the cycle. Choose silence over noise. Withdraw to reclaim your mental space. Third, Symbolic reclamation. Mirrors, masks, and sigils once used to trap and manipulate can be turned against their masters. Adopt symbols of personal sovereignty, personal mantras, visual affirmations, sacred geometry, tools to reinforce identity and shield against psychological invasion. Fourth, community. The power of collective awakening is undeniable. Seek out those who share your quest for truth. Share knowledge, expose deception, and support one another in mental and spiritual freedom. These aren't merely tactics. They're a path back to the self, a reclaiming of the soul that the Pembertons sought to steal and the digital gatekeepers aimed to fracture. Remember, this journey is not for the faint-hearted. It demands courage to face uncomfortable truths, discipline to resist seduction, and resolve to walk the lonely path. But once you cross the threshold, you emerge a different man. Stronger, clearer, free. In Section 15, we confront the ultimate question. What is the true cost of ignoring this darkness, and what awaits those who refuse to see? Section 15. To ignore this darkness is to surrender, not just your mind or your life, but the very essence of what makes you human. Your freedom to choose, your power to resist, your right to know truth. The Pembertons' legacy is not just a shadow in history. It's a warning, a mirror held up to every system, every institution, every whispered promise of salvation or progress that demands your silence and submission. Those who walk blindly toward the gate risk becoming nothing more than echoes, souls lost to forces that thrive on confusion, fear, and obedience. But the cost is greater still, because the manipulation doesn't end with death. It seeps into generations, into families, into the unseen bonds that tie you to the past and the present. You are the battleground now. The question is no longer if you will face this darkness, but how. Will you be the gatekeeper of your own soul, or will you hand over the keys, willingly or not, to shadows that wear masks and speak in tongues you cannot understand? The choice is yours, but once you see behind the veil, there is no going back. Remember this, true power belongs to those who see, who dare to pull the thread and unravel the web. The history of the Pemberton family is not just a tale of greed and murder. It is a blueprint for control that has haunted America since its earliest days. But knowledge is freedom, and freedom is the greatest rebellion of all. If you are ready to walk this path, comment below one last time. I am the gatekeeper of my own soul. Say it twice. Let it seal your awakening. This is the hidden history that changes a man forever. And now it is your turn.